Hello everyone and welcome to SUNUP. I'm Lyndall Stout. We're finally seeing cattle grazing on wheat around Oklahoma, and that's where we want to start this week with some questions that producers have about the crop itself, including reports about yellow wheat. For some answers, we turn to our extension wheat pathologist, Bob Hunger.
So over this past fall, there's been lots of reports of yellow wheat come in to the diagnostic lab and to the extension specialists at OSU. And most of that was attributed to the cold, wet soils that we'd had, because we had one of the wettest records, wettest months in October for Oklahoma. And you have those cold, wet soils, the wheat is going to yellow, some from the cold and wet, some from the leaching of nitrogen down below the root system. But over the last couple weeks, we've also had some reports come in and some photos and samples come in that were very heavily infested with leaf rust on the lower leaves. And that's not atypical. We see leaf rust in the fall quite a bit in Oklahoma. This year it came a little bit later than usual and not quite as heavy, but we definitely are seeing some of that in wheat in Oklahoma as well. The rust that is there with these kind of cold temperatures that we have, those infected low leaves will slowly die, and with the cold temperatures there won't be new infections occurring on the emerging leaves, and so over the winter leaf rust gets knocked back pretty hard. The concern is that if we have a mild winter, it could make it through the winter, and then that inoculum would be there to start the rust infection in the spring again. If it is real mild, the thing to start watching for would be early stripe rust infections, especially more in southern Oklahoma, because Texas would be much more mild than us, and stripe rust spores could blow up from Texas. And I've seen stripe rust as early as late February in middle and southern Oklahoma. But watch for that and watch for the leaf rust would be the main things. And then, but like I say, typically the winters will take care of those. We've run in the diagnostic lab probably at least a dozen or more samples, checking just to make sure that they were not positive for wheat streak mosaic virus, high plains virus, or barley yellow dwarf, and none of them have been positive for that. We even ran a few samples for soil-borne mosaic virus, and none of them were positive for any of those viruses. But there is that concern because we have had wheat streak fairly bad the last couple of years. Number of growers with the leaf rust that we have seen are wondering if they should spray, and as I said, it usually will die out mostly over the winter, and then have to watch in the spring, but it's more so that application of fungicide in the spring that's much more important.
It is a busy time of year for weaning and selling calves. Here to talk a little bit more about it is Dave Lalman, our extension beef cattle specialist. And Dave, we want to help people really get off on the right foot and get set up for success. So you have a few tips to pass along, starting with nutrition.
Yeah, so there'd be common sense things, simple things like, once the calves are weaned, make sure that they have a balanced nutrition program. Probably going to want to work with an extension educator or a nutritionist at the company that supplies feed. One of the things people will want to do is just make sure you have a balanced nutrition program so that the calves gain appropriately. One thing to think about there perhaps is if they're going to go to a high nutrition program such as wheat pasture, for example, there's probably no need to push them hard or try to make them gain a lot of weight before they get turned out on wheat. So a more moderate nutrition program that, most people are probably going to feed a lot of forage, maybe a little bit of a protein supplement, vitamin and mineral. On the other hand, if the calves are going to go on to a feed yard or something like that, they might want to consider a little more aggressive weight gain and therefore more concentrate feed.
Let's talk about bunk space and kind of what the rule of thumb is there.
Calves are going to need adequate bunk space if they're getting a supplement. 1.5 to 2 foot per animal ought to be adequate. And then, simple things like don't feed the calves before they're all gathered. If they're in a large pasture and it takes them a while to come to the truck, for example, if you feed right away, those aggressive calves are going to get a lot more than their portion.
And then what about the feed itself and feed additives?
One concern after weaning, particularly if the calves are in a dry lot or a feeding area that's concentrated with manure, you can see coccidiosis infection over time. And of course, we just suggest that people consult with their veterinarian so that they have a good understanding of how to deal with that if that problem does arise. But there are feed additives that can be incorporated into the feeding program to help with that problem. The 3 feed additives that are available for prevention of coccidiosis in beef calves are Decox, Rumensin, and Bovatec.
Now, we're just kind of scratching the surface today. A great resource, of course, is always the local county extension office.
They've got access to all this information through our extension publications.
Okay, great. Thanks a lot, Dave. We'll see you again soon. And for more information, we have some links for you on our website, sunup.okstate.edu.
The snowstorm that we experienced at the first part of the week was a good reminder that hay feeding season is right here upon us for those cow-calf operations that are going to have to feed some supplemental forage during the course of this winter. One of the key questions that always arises is, how much hay do I need to feed to a cow during the course of the winter, and therefore make the calculation as to how much hay I need to have on hand for the entire herd. Well, let's go through the procedure to calculate what a cow might need. Let's assume first of all that we're working with spring calving cows and they weigh an average of about 1,200 pounds while they're pregnant, and they're going to calve sometime in February and March. A 1,200 pound cow at this time of year can consume about 2% of her body weight in grass hay. Now that will vary according to the quality of the hay. If it's really poor grass hay, very low quality, then that percentage goes down to 1.5. If it's real high quality hay, or even something like alfalfa, then it can go up to as high as 2.5% of her body weight. But more typical, that 2% figure is a good one to start with, and that assumes that the hay quality is something around 8% crude protein. Okay, if we're getting 2% of her 1,200 pound body that she can consume every day, that's 24 pounds. But let's remember that that means that that hay is 100% dry matter. That's using a calculation that has no moisture involved. Well, it's just not the case on the real world situation, as we would call it on an as-fed basis. Most grass hays will run someplace around 10 to as low as 7% moisture. So for this example, let's use 8%, that it's 92% dry matter. That means then that instead of taking out 24 pounds of that grass hay in order to meet her needs, now on an as-fed basis, we require 26 pounds per head per day. But that still isn't the end of the story, because unfortunately cows don't eat every ounce of hay that we take out to them in the hay feeding pasture. There will be some wastage. And again, it'll be quite variable depending upon the quality of the hay and the kind of feeder that we are using to put the big round bales in. Hay wastage may vary as much as from a low of about 6% to as high as 20%. If we use in this example something kind of in the middle there, around 15%, which I think is fairly typical, then that means that instead of taking out the 26 pounds that we talked about earlier, in order to again meet the needs of the cow, including the hay wastage, we're going to take from the hay feeding area, the hay storage area, 30 pounds per cow per day that we're feeding the hay to these cows through the course of the winter. The other thing that changes, of course, is when that cow calves and she becomes a lactating cow, and now her requirements go up even more, and we go through all of those same calculations. We can simplify it and say it's going to take about 36 pounds of that same grass hay to take care of that lactating cow after she calves in February and March before spring grass starts to grow. So what does this mean in terms of the entire winter and the hay needs that we need to plan on. Generally, I would say we would expect someplace around 90 to 100 days of hay feeding. It's going to vary according to the weather, the other kinds of forages and feeds that we have available, but that might be a good starting place for our calculation. To boil that down, then, that basically means that for that cow that's going into the winter pregnant, that we're going to need someplace between 1.25 and 1.5 tons of that grass hay stored and available and ready to go for her this winter. If we have a mild winter or we have other sources of feed available, we may use much less than that. Unfortunately, if we have one of those real heavy winters with lots of snow cover, it may require even a little bit more. But that's a place to start to get an idea of how much hay we need to have stored for those cows this winter and how much we need to take out each day when there's snow cover on the ground and that's the only forage they have available. Hope this helps you as you plan your winter feeding needs this year, and we look forward to visiting with you again next week on SUNUP's Cow-Calf Corner.
Hello, Wes Lee here with the weekly Mesonet weather report. Winter made a statement this week with an extreme cold front. The entire Great Plains dropped dramatically into freezing conditions. Oklahoma had minimum lows drop to around 25 degrees below normal for this time of year on November the 10th. Temperatures remained low until returning to more normal conditions later in the week. The coldest day of the week was Tuesday, when morning temperatures reached single digits in the Panhandle and upper Northwest. Eva reached the state's lowest temperature, dropping to a mere 7 degrees. All 120 Mesonet sites dropped below freezing on this morning. Strong north winds coupled with these temperatures made wind chills even more brutal. Here we see minimum wind chills on Tuesday morning were 0 or below at 12 Mesonet sites. Beaver was as low as a -5 degrees. Wind chills even reached single digits as far southeast as Fitztown in Pontotoc County. The Cattle Comfort Index shows that they had to endure even worse conditions on Tuesday morning. The negative numbers of the index over much of the northwestern half of the state put cattle in the cold danger category. Even the warmest station at Broken Bow was still in the cold caution range. Gary is up next with more information on this near record-breaking cold front.
Thanks, Wes, and good morning, everyone, to this last Mesonet weather report before Thanksgiving. And as usual, we have some good news and some bad news. So let's get right to it. Well, the good news is the state remains mostly drought-free, 98% of the state, in fact. The bad news, that 2% of the state in drought has been there for several weeks. In fact, it's been there for several months up in northeast Oklahoma. And that area has remained unchanged for the most part. If we look at the percent of normal rainfall map for the last 30 days, we can actually see a few reasons for concern, especially up into north central Oklahoma, where those percentage of normals are down into the 20 to 30% range and up to the 40 to 50% range, extending down into central Oklahoma and also over to Osage County where that drought persists. So again, an area of concern that we're going to watch. Now, I certainly don't need to tell anyone that we've been cold. In fact, we've been January style cold over the last week or so. We can look at the hours below freezing from Oklahoma Mesonet. We're going to skip the 32 degree mark and go straight to 28 degrees and 24 degrees. Again, this is from the Oklahoma Mesonet over the last week. We can see southeast Oklahoma below 28 degrees, about an hour or so, extending up into central Oklahoma. We get up into the 40 to 50 hour mark, and then up above 60 hours in the Oklahoma Panhandle. Drop that mark down 4 degrees, so the hours below 24 degrees. Southeast Oklahoma escaped that really frigid air, but we go from 5 to 10 hours down in parts of southeast Oklahoma, up to 30 hours in central Oklahoma, and then the same about up into north central Oklahoma, but we do see a few 35s, a few 36s, all the way up to 42 in northern Osage County. So lots of really frigid weather for this time of year. So a little bit unusual to be that cold for that long of a period this time of the year. We usually see that as we get into December, January. But allergy sufferers, of course, are very happy to see that. Others, not so much. That's it for this time. We'll see you next time on the Mesonet Weather Report.
It's that part of the show where we catch up with Kim Anderson and talk about the wheat markets. Kim, has there been any news in the markets?
Well, most of the news is in the world market. Of course, they're talking about Russian wheat production, but not necessarily this year's production. I think it's pretty much stable at around 2.6 billion bushels. There was one analyst came out this year, and they thinks that Russian wheat production has peaked out and will probably back off 2 or 3% as they bring in other crops along with wheat. The question is it 2 or 3% off of 3.1 billion or 2 or 3% off of 2.6 billion? An interesting deal, the Iraqis tendered for 475,000 tons of wheat this week. Their bids, I think they took one around $7.35 a bushel, cost and freight. That poured in at Saudi Arabia. And you can compare that to $7 in mid-July. And lastly, Iraq announced that they wanted to look at buying wheat from Russia. You could get concerned about that, another Russian market there, but Russia's topped out on exporting their wheat. They export all the wheat they produce. It's just which countries are going to get it, and so I think that'll have zero impact on our price.
So to dig a little bit deeper into that, you said tender. How does that work? Does the country say, we want wheat and put it out to bid? How does that work?
Yeah, that's exactly how they do it. Egypt, they said, we want to buy 475,000 metric tons delivered on such and such period. And then countries, not countries, but companies, Cargill and other large ADM, other large countries that deal both in the United States, they deal in Argentina, they deal in Australia, they deal out of even Russia. They'll bid on that, they'll make offers to the Saudis based on a certain protein meeting their contract specs originating at a certain country, and then the Saudis select that offer that they feel best with.
So it's not a company in a country saying, hey, I need this kind of wheat. It's actually the country, the kingdom, the collective?
Well, it could be a flour miller in a country like Mexico. One or several flour mills may get together and tender for a certain amount of wheat to come in. But if it's Egypt or if it's Saudi Arabia or a country like that, then it is the government buying agency that tenders for that wheat.
So to bring that back stateside, is there any news in the wheat world going on?
Well, if you look at what's going on the wheat market here, they're mostly talking about plantings. All winter wheat plantings were reported at 89%. The average is about 94. Kansas at 90, average is 98. Oklahoma is 84. The average is 85. So Oklahoma's way behind. And they're talking about, I was talking to some producers this week about their late planted wheat. I think they feel better for the harvest only wheat with the late planted wheat. Their talk is that wheat that was planted early, that's for harvest only, is overtaken with weeds, and they've got a lot of weeds problems that they've got to take care of. And so if it'll dry out and then get this wheat in, it's probably better off than if they'd have got it planted early.
So it sounds like there are countries out there wanting to buy wheat. There's Oklahoma wheat being planted a little bit late. Both of those, does that help the price of wheat in Oklahoma?
I think that'll help the price of wheat as we get out into June of 2019, because I think late planted wheat, when you don't have the weed competition for those nutrients, you're going to have probably a higher quality kernel, and the market's going to need that kernel. We've talked about that earlier, next June. And so I think it'll help our prices if we can get it in and get it up and harvested in good condition.
Let's jump into cotton. There's a lot of cotton still in Oklahoma.
And that cotton, most of that cotton's still in the fields. You look at the average amount harvested on this time of year, right now it's 31%. On the average, we're about half done, or 48%. And cotton price in Oklahoma just pretty stable. It's went up a little bit on the board, but Oklahoma hadn't seen much of that price increase. I don't see much reason for it to go up or down, because I think the world pretty much has an idea of what our cotton production is going to be.
Okay, thank you much. Kim Anderson, Grain Marketing Specialist here at Oklahoma State University.
With Thanksgiving right around the corner, it's time to talk turkey, and we're here with Darren Scott, a food scientist at the Food and Ag Product Center. And this time of year, we have our Thanksgiving dinner and then almost immediately need to take a nap. Does turkey really make us sleepy?
Well, that's kind of a little bit of a rumor or a misnomer. It's not really the turkey that makes us sleepy. It's reputed to be the tryptophan that's there. But there's really not that much more tryptophan in turkey than there is in other poultry, sort of like chicken. Approximately 1/4 gram per 100 gram of poultry.
So you would have to eat a lot for turkey to specifically to make you sleepy.
Exactly. You find tryptophan in other foods. Well, tryptophan is an essential amino acid, which just means it's a nutrient that we can't normally produce in our bodies. So we have to get it from the food that we eat. And so we find tryptophan in things like red meat, almonds, chocolate, soy, and some nuts. And so what you find is that it's this combination of carbohydrates that we eat along with the tryptophan is sort of the current thinking that causes us to get sleepy. We eat lots of yams, desserts, things with lots of sugar and carbohydrates in them during the holidays. And so this combination of turkey along with these carbohydrates, as we digest them, what happens is we indirectly influence the amount of serotonin that we have in our brains. And the serotonin actually gets metabolized into melatonin, and it's the melatonin that we think actually makes us drowsy.
And then does that make you hungry like 2 hours later eating all of that stuff in combination? Because that seems to be my habit.
It does me too.
Now, in terms, you mentioned amino acids and tryptophan. What else is that sort of composed of from a scientific point of view?
Okay. All right. Essentially, proteins are made of amino acids, and the tryptophan is an amino acid. And what we find is in our food, we have these carbohydrates, these fats, these proteins, all of these things in combination that, are part of a good meal that we metabolize. And so they all help us make us full, and they all help us make us, healthy.
Okay. And it all just kind of blends together to make for an enjoyable, I guess, Thanksgiving and all of that. Okay, a great lesson on turkey. Doesn't necessarily make you sleepy. It's all the other stuff.
It's all the other stuff in combination.
Okay, thanks for clearing up the myths.
Sure.
Darren Scott here at the Food and Ag Product Center.
Managing for white-tailed deer is an objective of a lot of landowners in Oklahoma. And many of these landowners have oak forest on their property. But the vast majority of these oak forests are completely unmanaged. So the landowner might put a food plot in or manage their grazing, but then the forest itself is usually an afterthought. And this is unfortunate because if you have a forest on your property, that's probably the acreage that you could do the most benefit for white-tailed deer. So for white-tailed deer, the bulk of their annual diet are forbs. These are broadleaf herbaceous plants, things like sunflower. They also eat a lot of vines and shrubs, browse species that are in the understory. So in a forest, the whole trick to increase the carrying capacity, the amount of food that's in that understory, is to get more sunlight on the forest floor. So if that's your objective, there's multiple ways you can do this. We could just mechanically cut a tree, and that's often done, particularly if you want to regenerate a forest, if you want that tree to actually resprout. Because remember, the vast majority of the woody plants in Oklahoma will resprout if you cut them. However, a lot of these plants, especially the oak, they're not palatable to deer. So in those situations, we may just want to kill that plant to make room for more desirable species. So if that's the case, there's multiple ways we can do that. You can cut the tree off at the base and then immediately spray the cambium. That's that outer part, that growing part, the inner bark of the tree. And you need to do that within about 15 minutes before the cambium seals up. And there's multiple herbicides that are effective at killing a tree in this way. We can also girdle the tree. And some people will want to just girdle without spraying herbicide. That can kill the tree, but often it will take a long time to kill the tree by girdling alone. So by adding herbicide to the girdle, you can effectively remove that tree rapidly from the system. Another way is to simply take a hatchet and a spray bottle and make hatchet marks into the cambium of the tree and spray a herbicide. And if you're using a herbicide like a Mazapir, This can actually be much quicker because you don't have to put very much herbicide in the tree. With the Mazapir, you can simply put 1 hatchet mark for every 3 to 4 inches of DBH. That's diameter at breast height. So if you'll measure the tree off and see how far across the tree measures, the diameter, and then divide that by 3 or 4, then that's how many hatchet marks you want to put in the tree. Additionally, you may just want to provide cover for deer. So instead of cutting the tree down flush with the ground, sometimes we'll do what's called a hinge cut. We're going to cut it off about breast height, and we're just going to start cutting from one side so that the tree will slowly start to fall the opposite way. And as that tree starts to fall, just stop cutting and let the tree slowly break over, but not a clean break. So you want that tree, on the case of a hinge cut, to stay connected to the root. So if this is something that interests you and you want specific recommendations for your property, contact the Oklahoma Forestry Services or the Oklahoma Department of Wildlife Conservation to get them to come out and provide you some technical guidance.
That'll do it for us this time. Remember, you can find us anytime at sunup.okstate.edu and also follow us on YouTube and social media. From all of us at SUNUP, we want to wish you and your family a very safe and happy Thanksgiving, and we'll see you next time.